So thank you so much for coming to this session. My name is Sanja, and I actually traveled here from Buenos Aires to join you all. When I talked to Al and David about this conference, and they said, hey, we'd love for you to come, I thought, London is so far now, but I can't miss it. So I packed my 8-month-old baby, and we made the trip. We made it yesterday morning. So if any of you were in the session earlier today, and you might have heard me get tongue-tied a little bit on some things, is that we're running on a really long flight and a little bit of sleep. But usually I have more than plenty of energy to compensate for that. So I'm hoping you'll still very much enjoy this session today. So before we jump into employee experience and human-centered design, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the company that I work for, mostly to put things in context around why I'm so passionate about employee experience and building the right culture for an organization. So how many of you have heard of Globant? We have somebody. So Globant is actually a company that was started in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and that's probably why a lot of you don't know Globant by name yet. It's headquartered now out of Buenos Aires and out of San Francisco. Globant works with really large organizations like Google and Sony, and what we are partners for actually software development. And so some of our founders joke that we're kind of like the Intel inside, except for you hear about Intel because there's a sticker, but when you go to Disney and you look at the band, you don't know that Globant is a company that developed that. But why is that important? So I don't know how many of you know about Argentine economy, but it tends to do these kinds of things. Yeah, they're really, really great peaks, and then it tends to go down again. And so Globant is one of the 4 unicorns out of Argentina. It's one of the 4 companies that actually is on the New York Stock Exchange and is worth over $1 billion. And you think, wow, okay, that's pretty cool. A lot of startups want to do something like that, but not all of them succeed. And so when I first interviewed with Globant, I had the pleasure of talking with one of the founding members of the organization, and he said, you know, what was really important to me is we started 4 guys. We were at a bar having a beer, and we said, what are we going to do? It's 2003. Let's make a bet on something, right? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but let's try to do something. And they founded this organization. And Globant had this really great fortune that it was growing very quickly. But what had happened is originally it was, a bunch of guys in a room and girls coding, developing different things. Everybody knew each other. They knew each other's families, their pets, the kids. It was like a family. And all of a sudden you get to 100 employees. It gets a little more difficult. You get to 200. It continues to be challenging. And after they had a few hundred employees, they said, well, what we want to do is we want to build a culture where people are still as excited to be working together and working with us as they were when we were a startup. So they turned to technology when they thought about how do we continue to create and sustain this culture that is very much a place where our employees want to be. And so that's as much background I'll give you about Globant, but just to give you some context around it, it was something that internally for the organization, I believe was a huge differentiator for why we were able to be one of those many startups, but actually succeed and continue to grow. And now we're a little bit over 8,000 employees across 14 different countries. Next, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. So, when you get that question, I don't know how often you get asked, but tell me one interesting thing about you. Oh, I hate that question because I never know. I think, well, I'm not particularly a boring person, but I don't have that, wow, I jumped out of the helicopter in the Alps and went skiing, or I did something, truly, truly different. And I was actually recently speaking at a conference, and I was thinking back about my life and, reflecting on why is it that I really do what I do. And so this is a little bit of my life story. So I mentioned that I came from Buenos Aires, but I'm definitely not from there. I've been living there 4 years. Originally, I'm from former Yugoslavia, born and raised in Serbia. In the 90s, I moved over to the US, spent a couple of decades there, but I really miss being in Europe. And so for a while, I was thinking, how do I get back there? How do I get my career path back? And finally, I made it back to London. And I lived in London for 2 years, and I loved it. I loved being back in Europe. It was really, from a personal cultural standpoint, it was a place where I really felt like I belonged. And then I fell in love with an Argentine. And so I went to the completely other part of the world. And so in the last 11 years, I lived on 3 different continents. But in the last 11 years, I only worked for 2 companies. And that's pretty different, right? Now you talk to a lot of people. Maybe I'm not a millennial, but people, especially about millennials, will say, they change companies all the time, they move around. And so I thought, maybe that's pretty interesting about me. And so why is that? Why is it that I choose an organization and I stay there? Because culture is so incredibly important to me. Choosing a company where I really feel the sense that I can accomplish what I want to accomplish, that sense of belonging, that I really do get excited to go to work every day is really important. So that was part of my personal reason why do I want to study organizational culture and really help companies and Globant with their employee experience. So now with that background, we'll jump into the actual topic of the session, but I think some of it will resonate as we go through. So how many of you have looked at design thinking and human-centered design before? Okay, so we have a good number of people. So it was really interesting. So I lead a product group at Globant. And what's really fun for me is so my background is in organizational psychology. I have designers on my team, I have product owners on my team, I have a tech team. And so we meet every week for the different products to go through our different roadmaps and brainstorm what we're going to do. And so we have individuals with very different backgrounds. When I went back and said, okay, let me think about what is our process, what does design thinking look like, what does human-centered design look like, it was really nice to see this path. I think it's very a good roadmap to follow when you're developing any employee experience initiatives or looking to build a culture. The thing that we'll spend the most time on today is empathizing and learning about your audience. And so why? So I told you a little bit about my background again, so it becomes relevant. It wasn't just a random story, I promise. And so for me, I thought, okay, I've lived in different countries. I've lived in very different economies. I've had different kinds of upbringing. I've been very fortunate to interact with different kinds of people. So that naturally should make me better at empathizing, right? Because I can take different mindsets. And I still found myself talking to different people, and it's our human nature that we judge. And we want to impose our thinking on somebody else. And I thought, wow, this is a much tougher exercise than I thought it would be, right? I think you just need to be open-minded and you can connect with somebody pretty easily, but it takes a lot more practice and discipline than that. Another thing when it comes to empathizing that I've realized that it becomes more challenging, especially when you need to learn an audience, do you relate to more? And why? Because you feel like you understand them. In a way, when we're building something internal to our organization, we are an employee. So when we're building a culture, when we're thinking about the experience, when we're thinking about the journey map, we feel like we are already the experts. So how much time do I really need to know or really need to spend getting to know my audience? And Patrick and Luke gave a really great presentation earlier around all the different data that they gather about their employees. But not all of us do that, right? And I've even noticed in my cycle of product development, sometimes I get so excited to do something, I just want to jump in and say, wait. But I'm a sample size of 1, right? So I've had enough statistics courses to know that that's not going to be significant or relevant in any kind of study. So that's where I think empathy, when it comes to our kind of work, is so important, again, because we are our own audience. So keeping that open mind and really getting to know somebody is so critical, and it becomes a little more challenging. So once you've gone and you've talked to your employees, you've done field research, you've gathered all of this information around what makes a great culture, why, if I have people and I want them to stay in the organization, what is it that they want? What do my people want? What makes my organization different? So you start with these big ideas, right? And I promise you, if you haven't done it, you're going to find it very eye-opening and very surprising. You go and define what are the key questions that I want to answer, right? Because especially when you think about employee experience, it's so broad. And there's so many different challenges that you can decide to address. So what are the key themes? What are the key things that people are interested in? What are the things that are going to make the greatest impact on your organization, right? So you start broad, you collect all this information from your employees, and you start to narrow down. Then you go the idea to ideating, so brainstorming and creating solutions. So now you have all of these insights from people. You go down and you narrow it down to say, okay, these are the 3 challenges. Maybe I really want to change my performance management because I know it's tough, and organizations are going and saying, we're going to do away with reviews. Now we're going to do reviews. Now we're going to do feedback. We're not going to feedback. We're going to feed forward. We're not going to feed forward. We're going to do performance insights. It's really messy and complicated, but it's so important. So maybe that's something that you're going to figure out. You choose for yourself. And then you can have this amazing brainstorm. And what I love about this is there should be no stupid ideas here. Because what happens is when it comes to performance management, you could have talked to a lot of experts, you could have read a lot of really amazing articles, and so we have these preconceived notions around how to change or fix something. But the best things are ideas that nobody's thought of. And so when you go and you ideate and you have these ideas, the thought is, let's put everything on a board, let's put everything on a sticky note, let's just create a mess, and then let's go deeper, right? Let's not just stay at these top-level things that are maybe the most common ones, but what else can we do and what can we do differently? And that also goes back to emphasizing and defining, because one of the challenges that a lot of times we come across is that you have a symptom of an issue or you have a root cause. And what you don't want to do is try to solve for a symptom. You want to really get that deep understanding and have ideas to solve those. And then you start to choose prototypes, right? It's different ideas. So maybe my employees really want to be connected, right? They want to have that sense of belonging. And another really hot topic for a lot of industries is, do I have remote workers, right? Do we love that? Do we hate that? How do remote workers stay connected? Well, what an amazing opportunity to actually ask them and come up with different ideas. So you start to get really creative and think about, what could the solution look like? What are some things that we can be doing? And then you test that. So I'll tell you that's also interesting here is with my team, we've come up with these things that we thought were just brilliant, and it makes a lot of sense, and we're going to do this analysis for our employees and tell them about their network and who they should be connecting with, and then we'll do a test and, what is this? I have no idea how to read this. What does this actually mean? So we think, okay, let's go back, either redo the prototype or maybe we missed something in the ideate. So this is not always a cycle like this, right? It can be interchangeable and go from one stage to another. But the idea is that you have really good data to start, and then you go through the process and get feedback from the different employees and the stakeholders. This is another way to think about design thinking and human-centered design. So what was interesting, and that's why I asked you at first, how many people have gone into, or how many people have worked with these different theories, is that if you look, even if you Google something, you'll see different variations, right? And design thinking is human-centered design is design thinking. At the base of it, it always starts with the people, the needs of the people, and really understanding what that is. The thing that I like about this diagram is it starts with the people, and then it talks about the possibilities of technology, right? And not everything has to be solved by technology, but we're seeing more and more today that it's a really scalable solution, oftentimes solution that does touch a lot of different individuals. So when you think about, if the technology is what I want to invest in because it has a far reach and I understand the needs of my people, then I think about, what are the requirements for the success? So do we want to drive satisfaction? Do we want to drive engagement? Do we want to drive the bottom line? We can figure that out, and then the answer is in the middle, right? So you start to think about, what are these different things that we're solving for? Okay. So I didn't want to tell you this at the beginning because I didn't want people to leave, but we're actually going to do an exercise because this is a workshop, and we're going to do an exercise on empathy. So I like to throw in quotes. I think probably most of us know the one from Steve Jobs. You start with your customer experience, which in our case is our people, and you work back towards the technology. The reason why I put this here is that whenever I talk to employees or I talk to our customers, a lot of times people are really quick to propose a solution. So they might not tell me what their need is or what they want, but they'll say, I would want this. Okay, I want more vacation days, or I want to work from home. Well, why? Help me understand your context and help me understand your need, and then I'll figure out if maybe that's the best solution or not. But the idea of starting really with experience and need is crucial. And Patrick and Luke earlier talked about the different audiences or the different personas. And I think that this is really important, and I wanted to touch on it too, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for everybody, right? And these personas are going to be different. These are just some examples. And we actually, in our work, we have a whole slide based on each one of these personalities and what could be their hypothetical motivations and their hypothetical fears, their goals and their career, etc. But what you start to understand is that it's not the same person that you're necessarily solving all the challenges for. You need to understand all of them and then think about, when I provide a solution, how is it going to resonate with these different individuals, and also what are their different needs? part of the reason, and I didn't, because Patrick and Luke were getting a lot of questions in their session, so I didn't want to ask one more because we also ran out of time. But one of the interesting things with this one that has helped me in my work is that it helps when you communicate with your stakeholders or your executive team on why you're creating something. Because what I found is I have the fortune of working very closely with one of our founders, and he has very strong ideas about our culture. And a lot of them are really, really brilliant, but what happens is oftentimes he's in the mindset of him. He's in the mindset of a person that's been with the organization for 16 years, of somebody that's in top management in a leadership group, and the way that he wants challenges solved doesn't always resonate with an employee or middle-level management. And so when we bring these personas back up, it's a really good way to communicate with him, hey, we need a different kind of solution, and maybe in a single solution we'll have different touch points, and this is what's going to be the most critical for our leadership team, but then actually in our research, our employees needed something like this. So we need to do both, and we're going to prioritize in this order of how we're going to build different things, but it really helps with expectation setting on when you're building something, when you're discussing with different individuals for why they might not really be bought into an idea that they're building, that it doesn't necessarily matter if it fits them because it fits a great part of the population. So what I want to do for our exercise is I love for all of you to team up with one other person. We have Post-its on our tables. I don't know if it's going to be quite enough, but I love to be hands-on. I love to have different ideas and stick things around. But I know we all come from different companies, probably different countries, different industries. But I wanted to do an exercise and see if we created an ideal organizational culture, what would that be? And I'd love to see how similar the ideas are, how different they are, what we find challenges to be. But more than anything, these are just some guideline questions. I wanted us to have an opportunity to practice empathy, to really be able to sit down with somebody else and talk about what gets them excited to work for a company. Whether it's your organization today or whether it's a company that you want to work in the future, if you get out of bed and, think about it, we still talk about work-life balance. We still talk about, but just imagine getting out of bed every morning and just being so excited to go to work. And maybe some of us are, maybe some of us are not, but it's interesting to me that after so many years that we've talked about employee satisfaction and engagement and now employee experience, that if you ask a lot of people, they don't have that passion. They don't have that excitement to go every day. And so how do we create something like that? And also what made me excited about this exercise is all of us are usually on the end that we're asking questions. And we don't that often get asked, right? Because we're the ones providing the solution. So it'll also give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit and say, well, what is it that I really want, right? Now I'm the one being able to make that decision or have my voice heard. What is that? So these are some of the different guidelines. So remember before I talked about it's tough for us because we also are the person solving for somebody's challenge. So when you're talking to someone, don't make assumptions about what it is they want. Just listen, ask them the different questions, and then listen to what their answers are. Asking the what, how, why. So understanding when somebody says, hey, this is what I want. Well, what about it is most interesting to you? Why? Why is that important? And then, I don't know, how many of you have heard about the 5 whys or 7 whys, that strategy? A few people. Okay. I love this one. And this is just an example that's pretty generic. But the exercise of 5 whys actually gets you to the root cause of something, right? So we talked about having a higher level symptom. And if you ask somebody, for example, in this case, somebody says, I want to own my own business. And so you might just take that at a face value. And it was funny because I got my MBA at Kellogg some years ago, and I was with my work group. And at some point, we all started talking about why are we there? Why are we getting our executive education? What drove us to an MBA? And our answers were all in the same room, in the same class, were so incredibly different. So incredibly different. I get goosebumps thinking about it because it was such an eye-opening moment. We're not doing the 5 whys exercises, but it just turned into it a little more naturally. But if you look at it, so it says somebody wants to own their own business, we might make some assumptions, right? Not asking more questions. Oh, it's because they want money. It's because they want freedom. It's because they want these different things. But when you start to go into the whys, you get to the bottom one, that it's supporting my family is the most important thing to me. So it's supporting a family, it's having time for a family, it's financial freedom, it's all of these different kinds of things. But when you ask somebody why multiple times, you really get to understand what it really is. And a lot of times it's eye-opening for us as individuals as well, because we might think, well, I want freedom. Well, why do I want freedom? What does that mean to me? Do I want freedom because I now live in Buenos Aires and my family lives in Serbia and I'd like to go see them? Do I want freedom because I have a hobby and I want to spend more time on that? So it starts to help us understand what is it, how can we actually create an organization where people can still have a tremendous impact, but we're creating an atmosphere where they can all really feel like they're making a contribution and thriving. So if you don't all mind partnering up, I'll put the questions back and just start to go through and have a one-on-one conversation with somebody. I think if you want to come over, yeah. And then what we'll do is I'll go around and see how things are going. I'll give you about 10, 15 minutes because I don't want to rush it too much. I want to give you an opportunity to really connect and remember empathy. Most of you probably don't know each other. If you do, you can also switch it up a little bit so it's a little more interesting for you. And then we'll go through and we'll share to see what is it that we love about our culture that we want to create? What do we see are some challenges in creating it? What is it about relationships with our colleagues? Are there some commonalities? And so what I'm also hopeful is that for each one of you that's working on employee experiments, you'll be able to take this data too, and it could be a starting point for having conversations within your own organization to understand, do these resonate with people? Are there things that we can actually leverage and create solutions for some of these? Do we need to tweak some of them? But I really hope that this is going to be a nice experience and practice of empathy and having those conversations, but then also be able to give all of us data points to go back and see in the journey of employee experience, where can I dig in deeper to see what I can do specifically in my own organization. Any questions before we get started? So I'll have you pair up and then we'll go through and quickly from each table say what are some of the things that we saw in each one of these categories, just to see what are some of the commonalities, some of the differences. And then I'm hoping if we have time, I have a couple more slides about measuring because we are at People Analytics Conference, so I didn't want to miss that part. So we'll almost fly through the whole design thinking and get to the end, but I'd love for us to brainstorm a little bit around these are the concepts that we want to build, and then based on our different experiences, it's great to implement something, but how do you know it's working, right? And so have a quick brainstorm around what are the different ways, if we implement it, we can choose a few ideas. How would we know if it's going well? How do we know what to adjust, etc.? So please find a partner, and I'll go around in a few minutes just to make sure everything's going okay. Or if you have any questions, feel free to come up to me too. So how was it? Did you guys find something interesting about yourselves or about others? Any deep-rooted whys that you were not aware of? Maybe? Okay. Well, at least it was really good chatter. So I don't know if we were all networking or really, I think there was some working on the exercise at least. I overheard. It's funny when you work on empathy, you don't want to butt in to people and say, hey, how's it going? Because hopefully people are really connecting with each other. So I try to go and be very respectfully listening. But I hope you all had a really good chat. So I realize that I don't have a keyboard up here to be able to key in different things. But what we'll do is I'll take some notes and then I can share with you after. Feel free to take your own, because I'd love to see what we came up with for these different areas. So what we're going to do, because they're filming the sessions, so they're available afterwards as well, we can go around the different tables. If you don't mind sharing some of the things, maybe some of the big things around what came out in your different conversations, what would make a great culture, what are some of the challenges, and then we'll rotate through on the different questions. Is there anybody that wants to get us started?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah! Mic. All right, sorry, she'll swing by with the mic.
Yeah, I'll speak louder in the meantime. What we love in our culture, we start off with autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And after the fifth why,
yes.
we came to the conclusion. Okay, we came to the conclusion that it's because it gives energy.
I love that.
So that was a good one. We had a second one, is that we work with people we like to build relationships, and also probably it gives energy as well. And we want to have a culture where it's possible to make an impact, to do the things that really matter.
I love it.
And things that challenges is the politics in the organization sometimes. It's an obvious one, I guess. And also being consistent in decision making and action taken. So we can sometimes be all over the place, moving from left to right. And while sometimes it's also good to have focus and stay in something for the long term rather than jump on every different trend. And then the relationships we find important was, most of all, trust. Yeah. That builds everything. And we also came up with authenticity, which, of course, in the length also is a bit of trust. Because if you are authentic, then you'll probably be trusted as well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Who else wants to share? I'm sure people came up with some really good ones. Don't be shy. All right, thank you.
So in terms of the culture, honest conversations, leadership transparency, fostering creativity, being business driven. You mentioned a point around positive pressure, so trying to not make people do more than what they actually can do, but putting people under this thing called positive pressure, and diverse teams as well. Open company culture, knowing that you can make a difference. And one of the things I've noticed now, we've had a bit of a reorg, is the office culture as well, in terms of wanting to actually come into work. So, you go in, you're going to be sitting around a certain group of people. How does that affect your mood and affect what you do? On the other hand, it could distract you as well, and engagement. So in terms of the challenges of that, well, just in general, less meetings. We have a lot of meetings where I work. And
Who has that problem? Show of hands. Too many meetings.
Okay, not just GSK.
That's a good one.
Less talking, more action. So people are often, let's do this, and 6 months later it's, let's do this, actually do it. And one of the interesting things we spoke about in terms of the leader relationship was trust. But we had a really good conversation about how does this interact with actually getting along. So I haven't been at Glaxo for a while, but because I was on a graduate program, I've had lots of managers in terms of how, in variations of how well I get on with them, also how much they actually trust me to do the actual job, and does one foster the other? Which way around does it work? Does someone trust you more because they like you? Does someone like you more because they trust you? That was it really. And what makes you excited to come to work? Starting or completing a project. Being enabled, I like that word. And a focus on stronger personal development.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're already starting, we just heard from two groups, and we're starting to hear some themes already with positivity, with trust. It's interesting. All right, who wants to go next? We have a half hand, yeah?
I think we had a really interesting conversation because we come from two different industries. So we have banking and pharmaceuticals, so kind of an interesting contrast. So when I look at our culture, so I work for Bristol Myers Squibb, our culture is very, very connected to the patient. So it's in everything we do. And so I would say our culture is really about how do we get patients or medicines to our patients to prevail over serious diseases. I think the biggest challenge in that culture is like, how do you drive that? And given that we're an innovation company, how do you unlock that with people? So like we've done science on kind of what drives engagement in our culture, and we know that things like inclusion are important. We know things like strategy execution or perceptions around it are important. And we know that there's some workplace things that are also important, which we didn't talk a lot about. But what I talked about is culture is only understood, I think, that patient centricity. I'm relatively new to BMS. I've been there 2.5 years. I was sharing that in my first week, we had a patient up on stage, like at a town hall, talking about their experience using our medicines, the challenges they went through, how it's allowed them to extend their life, but also like what they face into every day with that uncertainty. And it makes it really real, right? And so I would say, I had no idea. And so I think one of the biggest opportunities is how do you make that more known to candidates, or like almost like before you join the culture, because culture can be a powerful thing if you can better leverage it outside of your own company. So how can you use it to attract people that maybe want to be part of that? So I think that's one of in some cases, we're also working on large acquisition. So when I also think about that we're acquiring Celgene, which is also very patient-centric. So we talked a little bit about, although that might be a big part of your culture, how you execute against meeting kind of that prevailing cultural thing can be very different. So how work gets done, how you make decisions, the speed at which you move, how you reward people can be very different between two companies. So I think one of the biggest challenges for us is how do you maintain that inclusion between and understanding there's more than one way to get it done. And I think that's our biggest challenge, which I think is going to come down to relationships, trust, which has already been said, and then also creating that environment where you you recognize different styles, thoughts, and so I think there's a lot of leadership. Like I think at the end of the day, I think leadership plays a huge role in establishing culture and maintaining culture, but also creating that environment. Yeah. And then in the banking, we talked a lot about, you talked about trust too.
Yeah, a lot of trust. I know. Yeah, so what we love in our industry is it is a lot of trust. So I think that's the main thing. We're left to get on with what we're doing. We're trusted to get on with whatever we need to work on. It's the flexibility as well. It's where we're working, what times are we working, have we got the right work-life balance, have we got time to spend with, if you've got kids or parents or other family members. The challenges in creating it is, where do you work in the industry? Are you client-facing, customer-facing? Are you business-facing? I think that's where the challenges mainly lie. And in relationships, it's the people that sit around you, the people that build you up, people that push you to do things like coming out your comfort zone, like Bradley's just done with me, coming out of my comfort zone doing this. It's people that push you to do things that you wouldn't normally do.
It's interesting how often trust has come up. I don't think a single person has spoken without talking about trust. And I think you're so right where you're saying is, how do you establish that? How do you create that? Why, right? Like, why is that trust important? I think the way you define it, it's important in so many different levels. And then how do you establish as a trust? Because maybe I want to work from home because of my circumstances, or maybe my commute is an hour and a half every day. And do I really need to be in the office? Yes, when I'm with a client or for a different reason, but otherwise, does somebody trust me to get my work done from home? How do I establish that? Who are the relationships with? The people that sit around you is a really interesting one. And it's come up a few times, and it's not, I've read studies about it, right? And especially studies around what kind of floor plan do you have? And in the US, it's usually the typical cubes. And then in Europe, it's a little more open floor plans. It depends where you are in the world, and it depends on the trends, right? Because sometimes an office is very much a status symbol, and you have an office and you've made it, and then you go to a different company and you're just sitting at the end of a table with everybody else, and you still made it because nobody has an office. It's just not a thing. But no matter what, you're either more exposed to people around you or less. And so that's something that's really interesting to me, because especially when you're in an organization, that it's people immediately next to you, but then you start to have people in different offices. You have to start having people in different hospitals, in different countries maybe, or in different states, and it becomes so big. So how do you form those relationships? Because there's so many amazing people in all of our organizations, and maybe some of them we've never crossed paths with, but if we could, how much of an impact would they have on our career? So really, hopefully, I don't know, my mind is really turning with the different things that I've heard. Hopefully all of yours is too, because I think we can apply different ways in our organizations. We have just a couple more minutes. Does anybody else want to share what they have, or do we want to talk a little bit about how do we implement or measure this, just to close it out? Okay, so I'm getting some nods on implementing and measuring. So one of the things with culture is that we just heard a lot of really great things, right? A lot of really great ideas. And I hope, again, that all of you in your conversations maybe learn something new about yourselves even that was interesting that maybe you haven't thought about in a while. We've learned new things around each other. And so what happens when you go away and you implement or you try to make a change? How do you measure that? So I had just a couple of slides that I mentioned. So measure where you can measure, you can't improve. There are many sayings like this, like rope doesn't get measured, doesn't get done. But to me, culture is so fluid, right? You don't have we're going to work on culture. We worked, it was a 2019 initiative, employee experience check, we're going to move on. It's something that's really fluid. It changes with the times, it changes with the people, it changes with industries, with technologies. And so it's something you always have to keep an eye on. And so how do you do that effectively over time? I just threw a bunch of screenshots here. I think to us, one of the interesting things that I've heard from different speakers today is how you go about measuring different things. And is it a report? Is it an annual survey? Is it a biannual survey? Is it something that's in real time? And I think the answer is it depends, right? It depends on what you're looking to impact. And so some of these things, it's funny because we talked about doing a meaningful job and how do you have an impact in the organization. And that's a couple questions that have come up before in my world. So I had them up there. As well, is how do you evaluate the trust, right? How do you define it still? Do you define it by giving people more ability to work from home, and then what is their productivity? Is it a relationship between different people and how they interact? And so some of the things that we've seen that are maybe a little less traditional ways to measure this, and I was just talking with Patrick and Luke about it, is a little bit around behavioral data. And so one of the things that was a little newer to me when I started working for Globant when it comes to culture is the idea of recognition and recognizing people's behavior and why do you do that. And I worked before with being able to give somebody a high five or different kinds of ways to actually provide, to highlight somebody's behavior. But what I realized when I really dug into it is what's the root cause? Why do you want to recognize somebody? And a lot of it tied back to organizational values and the reason of why you want to be a part of this organization. Is it about trust? Is it about making an impact? Is it about being innovative? And then recognition became that vehicle of actually celebrating when you see somebody in another colleague, when you see something that they've done really well, and being able in technology to recognize them, right? And so the powerful thing that did for Globant is it allowed us to measure a lot of different relationships when they were happening really naturally. So you talk about trust, and you talk about trust between a leader and an employee, and all of a sudden you can start to see very different patterns. For example, when a leader recognizes their employee, or where peers recognize each other to say, well, these two people have been working together for a year, and on average, leaders recognize their employees, once a month. And these two people have not had an exchange. What's going on in that relationship? Is there a lack of trust? You can dig in a little more. Also, we mentioned leadership and the importance of the relationship with the leader. And what happens is, of course, we've heard a lot of studies around people leave organizations because of bad managers. How do you manage that? And so a lot of times when you have connections between different employees, what happens is that it's no longer just up to one person, right? So you can start to measure as interactions between different employees, and we've done it based on recognition. We also recently implemented continuous feedback. And so what we're able to see is who actually gives feedback to who, right? Because it's open across the organization. I can give feedback to my CEO. Somebody from London can give me feedback in Buenos Aires after I leave the trip. And so it's in every which direction. And so what that also helps you is start to measure the relationship. So we talked about people that are around us, but can it open your eyes and understand, okay, so in this one office, people seem pretty isolated. They don't seem to be interacting with other groups, but wow, we have the specific offices where for some reason, the interactions, whether it's recognition, whether it's feedback, whether we're sharing photos from an event and tagging different people, there seems to be a lot more interaction. So how can we look at that and understand what's the culture that we can build? Why is it working really well in one place and it's not working in another? Because all of a sudden what it does is it opens up a person's ability to be happier, the kind of impact that they can have from the individuals that they're surrounded with. All of a sudden the organization becomes a place where everybody can interact, but we have to help employees know how to do that. We have to open their eyes to say, hey, you have an opportunity to interact with others more, and here's some ways that you can do that, right? And we talked about that earlier today, that just data for the sake of data is not as impactful. You really need to walk people through that process of how to take action. So those were just some examples based on the few themes that have popped up from today, but Do any of you have some anecdotes or some stories that you want to share about what you worked on with employee experience and the ways that you've measured and been able to say, hey, we just implemented, I don't know, a new wellness program, or we just implemented a new work from home program, and this is actually how we're tracking and measuring to see, is it successful? Is it, are we tying it to revenue? What kind of impact is it having? Is there any story anybody wants to share? Such a silent group. No, but I hope, I guess even without sharing a story, are you in the process of working on those kinds of things, being able to really focus on the change management? How many, I guess I should ask it in a different way, how many of us are still in the process of really figuring out, when it comes to explore employee experience, what is the next big thing that we should do, or the next big things? How many of you are in the process of figuring that out? Okay, so maybe that's why we're not at the measurement part yet, because we're still trying to figure out what to do. But that's one of the things that I would encourage you to do, is when you're putting these initiatives in place, sometimes it is pretty challenging to know that it works, right? And that's, I think, one of the things with culture, why if we talk about the C-suite and we talk about making an investment in culture, people will say, but how do we measure? How do we know that it's making an impact? To make sure that you prepare some of these things ahead of time to say, if we're going to have this kind of initiative, you can do things like surveys and understand satisfaction, do pulse surveys. One of the things that Patrick and Luke talked about earlier today is you don't necessarily have to survey everybody all the time, not to create fatigue in the different respondents. If you have behavioral data, I do think that it's a really powerful way to look at natural behaviors of people, because you're not asking them specifically at one point in time what's on their mind. Because one of the things that I've known, even with different experiments that we do, is there always seems to be something happening. Is it, did we just announce pay raises and promotions, or did we just have a holiday, or that just one of the countries maybe is going through an election or economic crisis, or what are all of these external variables that could have an impact? So when we have behavioral data, as much as possible, it equalizes those a little bit. And then we don't have to be as concerned about when we're collecting it, because you can see that information over time, and you can start to understand, okay, what are the different patterns? If there was an impact at one point, it's more evident, and you're able to see the true impact over time, and again, improve, make adjustments, because it really is an ongoing process. So that's all I had for today. Thank you so much for coming to the session. I do hope that you'll walk away with ways to think about better ways to collect information from employees, really connecting, whether it's through interviews, through surveys, but understanding what is it that's really important to them, and then thinking through going all the way through the journey to the way of measuring and saying, how do I represent the data? How do I continue to watch it so that way I can make sure that what I'm putting in place is effective, or what adjustments do I need to make over time to really have it as positive as possible? Thank you so much for your time.